Good day, all. This talk will look at the early history of superheroes. Superheroes began as exaggerated versions of real-life heroes, and humanity's earliest heroes were war heroes. They became heroes by winning the war. In early tribal societies, the war chief was the tribe's best fighter, which usually meant the tribe's strongest man. So, the first hero, who would become the first superhero, was the strong man. Oral histories and legends told of the great military prowess of the tribe's strong man. He symbolized the tribe as a whole, and his victories were in practice victories of the tribe as a whole. As tribes grew into nations, wars took place between large armies, and the best leader was no longer the strongest man, but the one with the best understanding of military tactics and strategic planning. So, the strong man gave way to the wise man. Sometimes a leader would be both a wise man and a strong man, but more often they would team up, in which case the wise man was always the leader, with the strong man as his strong right arm or his enforcer. Their female counterparts, the strong woman and the wise woman, followed later. The strong hero and the wise hero have become cultural archetypes which have endured for thousands of years, and to this day they remain by far the most common superheroes. In agricultural societies, it was often a short step from war hero to king. If a wise man could successfully run the army, then he could successfully run the government. Military leaders frequently became political leaders. This remained the case for thousands of years. And so, most early superheroes were kings. This applies to the earliest known superhero, Gilgamesh. The oldest work of literature in the world is the Epic of Gilgamesh, written on clay tablets in Mesopotamia over 4,000 years ago. And Gilgamesh was a superhero. That is to say, archaeologists believe that Gilgamesh was a real person. He was king of the city-state of Uruk in Mesopotamia in the Middle East, sometime between 2800 and 2500 BC, so over 4,500 years ago. But his story was told and retold and built up until it settled into its final form around 1200 BC. And in the course of over 1,000 years of retelling, Gilgamesh's feats grew to where he exhibited superhuman abilities, superpowers, like super strength. He had these powers because he was supposedly more divine than human. His father was the demigod king Lugalbanda, and his mother was the minor goddess Ninsun. The epic tells us that at first Gilgamesh was very spoilt and selfish and hard on his people, but that over time he mellowed and, perhaps even more importantly, went on various quests that took him out of the country. A historical parallel can be drawn here with King Richard the Lion-Hearted of England, who spent most of his reign out of the country fighting the Crusades in North Africa, and so became one of England's most popular kings ever. But the gods decided to punish Gilgamesh for being a bad ruler, so they created the wild man Enkidu to attack him. But then there's a plot twist that's still being used by Hollywood regularly to this day. The two alpha males meet, they fight, they beat the crap out of each other, Gilgamesh wins, and they promptly become best friends for life. Now, personally, that's not the way that I make friends, but apparently macho military types have been doing this for thousands of years. Gilgamesh and Enkidu became, in effect, the original Batman and Robin, superhero and super sidekick. Together, they went on quests and killed two monsters, the demigod Humbaba, the Terrible, and Gugulana, the Bull of Heaven. This angered the gods again, so they gave Enkidu a fatal illness. After Enkidu's death, Gilgamesh became scared that he was next. So he went on a quest to find immortality. This quest failed, but at the very end of the epic, he returned and saw the strong city walls of Uruk and realized that this was his true immortality, his legacy. He was a nation builder. He gave Uruk strong walls, a strong army, and strong government. And that is ultimately why he came to be seen as a superhero. He was a strong man who eventually became a wise man. He supposedly went on to rule Uruk for 126 years, which I'm pretty sure was also an exaggeration intended to make him seem superhuman. Why did the world's first superhero appear in Mesopotamia? Because that's where agriculture was invented. Small-scale horticulture or gardening existed earlier, but it was only around 5500 BC that Mesopotamia invented the plough and irrigation. Together, they allowed much more land to be cultivated. This meant much more food, which led to a population explosion. Tribes became nations, and nations formed city-states, beginning in Mesopotamia. Uruk was one of the earliest city-states to arise, and so was a regional superpower in its day. Gilgamesh was the superhero who symbolized the power of Uruk and the strength of its military. After Gilgamesh, there are two main sources for ancient superheroes: ancient Greek myths and legends, and the Bible. In this talk, we shall look at ancient Greece. The earliest Greek towns were settled between 6000 and 5000 BC, but it was not until after 1500 BC that warfare between them forced the larger towns to become walled city-states, such as Athens, Argos, Corinth, and Thebes. Like Uruk, these city-states built up their reputations by claiming to have been founded by superheroes. So, the early Greek superheroes were all just like Gilgamesh. They were all male military leaders who were demigods, who killed monsters and founded cities. It is likely that they are all exaggerated versions of real people, although after all this time it's impossible to be sure. Now, Greek myths and legends tend to be very long and complex, usually involving a lot of intrigue and plotting between royal families and between gods. I am not going to get into all these details. I'm going to strip the stories down to their bare bones and keep them as simple as I can. On the other hand, as I go through them, I shall regularly draw comparisons between ancient superheroes and modern superheroes. The Greeks blurred the line further between war heroes, superheroes, and gods. Society's way of thinking about the spirit world has evolved through 3 stages: spiritualism, polytheism, and monotheism. Early hunting and gathering tribes believed that everything in nature had a spirit. The spirit of the sun, the spirit of the winds, the spirit of the wolf, and so on. The invention of agriculture changed society from small tribes to large nations. And while tribes could worship small spirits, nations had to worship big, powerful gods. But since there were many spirits, whole pantheons of major and minor gods emerged, such as that of ancient Greece. Eventually, the ancient Jews were the first to collapse all of these gods into one god and change polytheism into monotheism. Today, we're used to the idea of a single God who is all-present, all-wise, and all-powerful. But that's not how the ancient Greeks thought of gods. And that is not how they represented them. Rather, they were human beings with human failings like jealousy and anger, but with superpowers. In other words, they were in practice superheroes, which meant they were glorified versions of the military aristocracy. The gods of Mount Olympus were in practice superpowered versions of a king and his court. Ancient Greece had 14 main gods and goddesses. At the top were 3 brother kings: Zeus, who ruled the land, Poseidon, who ruled the seas, and Hades, who ruled the underworld. All 3 were warriors. Zeus could command the lightning, Poseidon could command the waves, and Hades could command the souls of the dead. After them came Ares, god of war, another warrior, and Apollo, god of archery, likewise. Hermes was the messenger of the gods, who could run super fast and even fly, showing the importance of communications in battle. Hephaestus was god of metalworking, meaning the maker of weapons and armor. The only god who was not directly connected to battle was Dionysus. He was not originally a god, but a demigod son of Zeus, who was elevated to godhood for inventing wine, and became the god of partying. Naturally, after a battle, the victorious soldiers wanted to get drunk and party, so in that sense, even Dionysus was connected to battle. The Greek goddesses were led by Hera, queen of the gods. She was the first mythical strong woman, and she established the royal line that ruled over the world from Mount Olympus. The other goddesses embodied womanly virtues. Aphrodite was goddess of love, Hestia was goddess of the home, Demeter was goddess of plants, since women did gathering and gardening, and Artemis was goddess of the hunt, since some women of the aristocracy did join the hunt. The only goddess, not directly but still indirectly connected to family and food, was Athena, goddess of wisdom. She was the first mythical wise woman. Since women did not command battles, she was not a military strategist like early wise men. Rather, she symbolized the old tribal medicine woman. In tribal society, it was women's job to gather vegetables, fruits, and herbs. It was also women's job to cook the food. which meant that women figured out how to turn herbs into herbal medicine. I have made reference to this in my talks on the history of healthcare. Since plants and herbs were seen as gifts of a goddess or of Mother Nature, the medicine woman was not just a healer, but also a spiritual leader or priestess, a wise woman. These two archetypes, the strong woman and the wise woman, began as goddesses and then became human superheroines, as we shall see shortly. The gods of Mount Olympus were, in effect, the first supergroup, the prototype for the Avengers and the Justice League. Each had their own distinct superpower, and they bickered a lot in their off time, but they fought together when they had to, and they always won. They also passed on their superpowers to human aristocrats by interbreeding with them. Zeus, in particular, was constantly being unfaithful to Hera and had many demigod children, but so did most of the others. The first Greek human superhero was Cadmus. Cadmus was a Phoenician prince and supposedly a grandson of the god Poseidon, who came to Greece, killed a giant serpent or dragon, and founded the city of Thebes in 1378 BC. Now, Thebes is actually much older than that. Archaeologists have found ruins there dating back to more than 3000 BC. But Cadmus turned Thebes into a city-state with not just strong walls, but a strong government and a strong army. He effectively made Thebes a regional superpower. Cadmus ushered in what has been termed the Greek heroic age, which lasted until after the Trojan War ended, so from 1400 to 1150 BC. This time period was when all the Greek superheroes were invented and supposedly lived. After Cadmus came Perseus, born around 1350 BC. Perseus was supposedly the son of Zeus and Danae, a princess of Argos. Perseus killed the sea monster Cetus and, most famously, the Gorgon Medusa, whose gaze could turn people into stone, and then founded the city of Mycenae. After Perseus came Bellerophon, born around 1300 BC, whose story is a bit different. He was the son of the king of Corinth, and also, somehow, the son of the god Poseidon. But he didn't found any cities. Instead, he killed his brother and was exiled. The rulers of the place where he was exiled wanted him dead, but were afraid to just execute such a high-ranking aristocrat. So instead, they set him some tasks which they thought would lead to his death. The most famous of these was to kill the Chimera, a monster with a lion's head, a goat's body, and a serpent's tail. Bellerophon did this by first capturing and taming Pegasus, the winged horse, and using him to mount an aerial attack against the Chimera and later on against other enemies. He was eventually rewarded by being given his own kingdom. But he became so proud that he tried to fly Pegasus to the gods on Mount Olympus. This angered Zeus, who made Bellerophon fall and live out his days broken and crippled. This is a familiar theme with ancient superheroes. They become too full of themselves and are punished for it by the gods. Pride goes before a fall, literally in Bellerophon's case. This is where we see the common people making their contribution to these legends. All of these superheroes were aristocrats, usually kings. Most of their story was usually about building them up and saying how great they were. But the common people warned their kings not to abuse their power. Even if they were supreme rulers and thought nobody could hurt them, the gods would find a way to punish them if they needed to. For kings, there can be a fine line between being powerful enough to protect your people and being so powerful that you become a tyrant. Superheroes were put up on a pedestal, but then told not to let it go to their heads. Some managed this balancing act, others, like Bellerophon, did not. Around 1286 BC, the greatest Greek hero of them all was born, Heracles, or Hercules. He was born in Thebes, was the son of Zeus, and is best known for his 12 labors, most of which consisted of killing various monsters. He had 4 wives, dozens of mistresses, over 80 sons, and presumably a similar number of daughters, although they weren't considered important enough to record at the time. He ruled Argos, and he founded the city of Tarentum. He went on many quests and fought many battles, in all of which he was victorious because, of course, he had super strength, because he was the son of Zeus. He was the ultimate Greek strongman, the original model for Superman. Hercules' life story has many ups and downs. He overcame adversity and was rewarded by the gods, but then got too full of himself and was punished by the gods. But after he served his punishment, he was forgiven by the gods and rose up once more, only to get too proud again. This cycle repeated several times in different ways. Indeed, it is unlikely that one person went through all the things that Hercules supposedly did, which means that Hercules was probably a composite of several real-life Greek heroes. Hercules was also famous for joining Jason's Argonauts. The Argonauts were the first human supergroup. Jason was the son of the king of Iolcos and the great-grandson of the god Hermes. But his father was killed by his own half-brother, who usurped his throne, and Jason had to go into exile. He returned as an adult and demanded his rightful throne, and was told that he could have it if he got the Golden Fleece. The legend of the Golden Fleece is actually strictly based on reality. At that time, a common technique when panning for gold was to put a sheep's fleece under the sluice because it would catch the little particles of gold dust, so that after a while you had a fleece full of gold, a golden fleece. So, the legend tells us that gold had been discovered in Greece, and Jason was in practice told to organize a raiding party and steal it. This may not sound so heroic, but that's basically what the aristocracy did. They got rich by looting and pillaging their neighbors. Jason was only given one ship, the Argo, so he put together a supergroup of about 30 elite fighters, the Argonauts. As I said before, the leader of the supergroup is never the strong man, it's always the wise man. Jason led the Argonauts because he was the best strategic thinker, even though Hercules was the strongest. In addition to his own brains and Hercules' strength, Jason assembled superheroes with other superpowers, such as the Boreads, Calais and Zetes, who were the sons of Boreas the North Wind, and so had wings and could fly. Pollux, who was another son of Zeus, and so was immortal. Orpheus, whose music was so sweet it could mesmerize humans, animals, and even monsters. And Jason's wife, the sorceress Medea. Medea was an early example of the archetype for the human wise woman. The tribe's medicine woman became the magic woman, the sorceress or the witch. To this day, many superheroines are in effect witches, such as the Scarlet Witch of the Avengers. So, the Argonauts were a true group of superpowered superheroes. Each of them, each of them, of course, had occasion to use their superpowers during the quest. For example, Orpheus' music drowned out the song of the sirens who are trying to lure them to their deaths. All of these Greek superheroes went on quests, like the one for the Golden Fleece. Usually, the superhero would be sent on a quest by his king. Successfully completing the quest would prove the hero's worthiness to become a king in his turn. However, it didn't work that way for Jason. After his return, there was some disagreement, people got killed, Jason was exiled again, and eventually he raised an army and regained his throne by force. So, the quest for the Golden Fleece did not directly gain Jason the throne in the traditional manner, but did still get him the gold he needed to raise his army and become king. With Jason and the Argonauts, we see superheroes begin to evolve. They exhibit both continuity and change. The continuity is that they all still have to defeat monsters. This is because monsters are not human. They are nature at its scariest. Nature can kill you in many ways. Wild animals, floods, tornadoes, lightning strikes, and so on. Monsters personify these threats, and all ancient superheroes had to overcome them. Monsters were in effect the first supervillains. But the earliest Greek superheroes were also all founders of cities, which in practice meant they established the first strong government in those cities and made them city-states. They were nation builders. Jason and the Argonauts, however, belonged to the next generation of superheroes. The Greek city-states had been established by his time and had grown so strong that they were conducting raids on neighboring city-states. So, that's what the Argonauts did. These raids were made to sound better and more noble by calling them quests. But in practice, they were just organized robbery and murder for the purpose of making the aristocracy richer. After the Argonauts, the next and last generation of Greek superheroes to emerge did so when Greece had grown stronger yet and mounted an all-out war, the Trojan War. Historians believe this was a real event, which took place roughly from 1191 to 1182 BC. Archaeologists have discovered the ruins of the city of Troy. According to legend, the Trojan War began when Paris, Prince of Troy, visited Sparta, and he and Helen fell in love. The problem with this was that Helen was the wife of Menelaus, king of Sparta. So Helen abandoned Menelaus and ran away with Paris back to Troy. Menelaus then gathered an army to attack Troy and get his wife back. Nobody knows whether these events actually happened or not, but even if they did, getting Helen was never anything more than a pretext for going to war. Ancient Greece, and in particular Sparta, was a very macho, militaristic, patriarchal society where men ruled and where among the aristocracy, women were basically just considered a means to getting a son, a male heir. Women were simply not considered important enough for men to go to war over them. And indeed, Greek mythology contains several stories of high-ranking women being kidnapped and taken away without anyone even going after them, let alone waging a war for them. No. The real reason the Greeks attacked Troy was the same reason that these city-states always attacked each other: to loot and pillage and steal the other side's wealth. A whole army of men did not go to get one woman. They went for the booty that they could plunder when they sacked Troy, which they eventually did. We can see here, as we saw with the tale of the Golden Fleece, that one of the main social functions of the Greek myths was to justify the actions of the Greek aristocracy. When the Greeks attacked somebody, it was supposedly a sacred quest because the gods wanted it, or it was because Helen was the most beautiful woman in the world, when in reality it was just about killing other people and taking their stuff. To win the war, Menelaus gathered the greatest group of Greek heroes since the Argonauts. The greatest of them all was Achilles. He was the son of a king and an immortal nymph. Achilles was supposedly invulnerable because his mother had dipped him in the river Styx as a baby. The only place he could be hurt was in the heel his mother had held him by. When Paris learned of this, he shot him in the heel with a poisoned arrow and killed him. As a result, of course, to this day the expression Achilles' heel refers to a person's one fatal weakness. Superman was originally a combination of Hercules and Achilles, super strong and invulnerable. And of course, Superman also has his Achilles' heel, kryptonite, the one thing that can hurt him. The legend of Achilles' invulnerability can perhaps be explained if we locate him in his social and historical context. At that time, Greece and Troy were still Bronze Age civilizations, using weapons and armor made of bronze. But some of the surrounding kingdoms had already entered the Iron Age. They had mastered ironworking and were making iron weapons and armor which were stronger. Achilles may have traveled to one of these kingdoms and had a suit of iron armour made for himself. On his return to Greece, bronze swords would have been unable to penetrate his iron armour, making him appear invulnerable. Such armour would have been weakest at the joints, such as the heels, which may have been Achilles' downfall. But if this is indeed what happened, then Achilles was literally the first Iron Man. The Greek strongman in the Trojan War was Ajax the Great. He was the son of a king and supposedly the great-grandson of Zeus. He was a huge man, the biggest of all the Greeks, immensely strong, very courageous, but so skilled at fighting that he was never injured in the entire war. He was essentially the next generation's Hercules. Now, these legends about princes and kings being giants with super strength did have a basis in fact, because when the aristocracy arose, one of the first forms of inequality that they introduced was inequality of diet. The aristocracy ate much better than the peasants. The aristocracy got the meat and fruit and vegetables, while the peasants got rice or bread or potatoes. In other words, the aristocracy got the proteins and the vitamins, so they grew bigger and stronger and healthier than the peasants, who tended to be short and thin and weedy. Compared to the peasants, the men of the aristocracy often were, literally, super strong giants. That's the way the aristocracy liked it, because it made it easier to put down peasant rebellions and maintain their rule. But this super strength did not come from the gods. It came from society. The aristocracy's superior social position allowed them to make themselves physically superior, bigger and stronger than the peasants. So here again, we see the Greek myths justifying aristocratic rule by turning an advantage that they got by exploiting the peasants into a gift from the gods and more proof that they deserved to rule. Of course, every supergroup needs both a strong man and a wise man. The Greeks' wise man was Odysseus. He was a king who, just for a change, made no claim to divine ancestry. He was very strong, but he was known more for his intelligence and was called Odysseus the Cunning. During the Trojan War, he became Menelaus' most trusted advisor and was always the voice of reason, restraining the more hot-headed commanders who wanted to attack right away and probably get themselves killed. In the end, it was Odysseus who came up with the idea that won the war, the Trojan horse. The Greek army supposedly sailed away, leaving behind a giant wooden horse. The horse was one of the symbols of Poseidon, god of the sea, because crashing waves look a bit like running horses with flowing manes. It was a common practice to make some sort of offering to Poseidon before embarking on a long sea voyage as a prayer for fair weather and good sailing. It was not common to make a giant horse, but it was a big army. As I'm sure you all know, the Greeks left some men inside the horse, so when the Trojans took the horse inside their walls, that night the men opened the gates and let the Greek army in. No trace has ever been found of this horse, but then, since it was wood, it would have rotted away long ago, so we shall probably never know if there ever really was a Trojan horse. Odysseus eventually became even more famous for his journey home from the war than for his role in the war. Each took about 10 years, with the war being described by Homer in the Iliad and the journey home in the Odyssey. Sailing home from Troy, Odysseus was blown off course by a storm, and to get home he had to outwit a number of powerful supernatural monsters and threats, including the giant one-eyed cyclops Polyphemus, the witch goddess Circe, the sirens with their deadly song, the six-headed serpent Scylla, and others. Eventually, all of his crew were killed except him. He alone was cunning enough to survive all of these dangers. He finally returned home, only to find that he'd been declared dead, and that a contest was being held for the hand of his wife Penelope. Odysseus won the contest, killed all the other suitors, and reclaimed his wife and his rightful throne, going on to supposedly become a wise and just king. A few words now about Circe, who was an early female supervillain, a witch. The rise of the evil witch stereotype also needs to be understood in its social context. In tribal society, if you got sick, you went to the medicine woman, who was a respected figure. But in ancient Greece, these medicine women were gradually pushed aside by male physicians who sought to discredit their female competition by calling their work witchcraft. The witch was a wise woman because she had knowledge that was hidden from men. But this knowledge made her independent and potentially dangerous. So, while there are stories of good witches who wielded white magic, like Medea, since men wrote most of the stories, there are far more stories of evil witches who wielded black magic, like Circe. So, the witch can be superhero or supervillain. But either way, the first human wise woman was the magic woman, or witch. The ancient Greeks also established the human archetype for the strong woman, the Amazon. The Amazons were women's original superheroes. They were warriors who supposedly founded an all-female society in the town of Themyscira. However, although Themyscira was a real town in ancient Greece, the Amazons are a myth. Archaeologists have found no evidence of an all-female society or an all-female army there or anywhere in history, and it's hard to see how such a society could survive for long. Still, the Amazons established an archetype of female strength. To this day, a strong woman may be referred to as an Amazon. And to this day, as we shall see, most major superheroines are either Amazons, like Wonder Woman, or witches, like the Scarlet Witch. After the death of Odysseus, around 1150 BC, Greece went into a decline. And the period from 1100 to 800 BC is referred to by historians as the Dark Ages of Greece. The most likely explanation for this is that, as I already said, some of Greece's neighbours entered the Iron Age before it did. iron weapons were superior to bronze weapons, so the Greeks were repeatedly defeated in battle until they too learned ironworking. This eventually happened, and after 800 BC, Greece saw a revival. The first Olympic Games were held in 776 BC, with the goal of gradually turning the Greek city-states to competition in sports instead of warfare amongst themselves. More importantly, the first Greek alphabet was developed around 800 BC. And between 750 and 700 BC, Homer wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey, which tell us most of what we know about the ancient Greek superheroes. Before then, these stories existed only as oral histories, told from generation to generation. Homer collected them and wrote them down for the first time. After that, Greece enjoyed a period of prosperity, culminating in the establishment of democracy in Athens in 505 BC. However, the problem with prosperity back then was that it made you into a target for others who would want to take your wealth by force. So, in 480 BC, Greece was attacked by the Persians, led by King Xerxes. At Thermopylae, 300 real-life Spartan heroes, led by Leonidas, sacrificed their lives to hold off the Persians long enough for the main Greek army to escape, leading to Xerxes' defeat later that year. Excuse me. The story of the 300 was made into a comic series in 1998, written by Frank Miller and Lynn Varley, published as a graphic novel in 1999, and made into a movie in 2006. Frank Miller, one of the best-known superhero writers, recognized that the 300 Spartans were ancient superheroes. However, despite Xerxes' defeat, the Persians continued to attack Greece periodically over the next century. And when they were not fighting the Persians, the Greeks went into an on-again, off-again civil war between two coalitions led by Athens and Sparta. This rivalry never was really settled until in 338 BC, King Philip II of Macedon defeated them both and united Greece in his League of Corinth. Just 2 years later, in 336 BC, Philip was murdered and was succeeded by his son, who became known as Alexander the Great. Within just 3 years, by 333 BC, Alexander had conquered the Persian Empire, the Egyptian Empire, and northern India, to create the largest empire in the world up to that time. However, after his death in 323 BC, his empire fell apart very quickly. After Greece, the next superpower to emerge was, of course, the Roman Empire. Rome's first military victory over Greece was around 200 BC, and in 86 BC, Rome captured Athens and essentially conquered all of Greece. However, the relationship between ancient Greece and Rome was very unusual, in that Rome conquered Greece militarily, but Greece conquered Rome culturally. Greek culture just took over Roman culture. Rome adopted all of Greece's gods, heroes, legends, essentially their whole cultural history. All the Romans did was to change all the names to Roman names. So, Heracles became Hercules. Odysseus became Ulysses. Zeus became Jupiter. Hermes became Mercury, and so on. Rome never invented any superheroes of its own. It just Romanized all the Greek superheroes. However, this meant that as Rome's military conquests grew, so did the influence of Greek culture and Greek superheroes. As the Roman Empire came to encompass most of Europe, Greek culture became the foundation of European civilization. Greek gods and superheroes became known throughout the Western world. And, as we shall see in later talks, they provided the prototypes for most modern superheroes. That concludes what I have to say on the most ancient superheroes. Transcript of this talk is attached if you're interested. Good day.